Before we start, let me give you some background information about our work too. So we're about to start the third day of the KICS EAP Education Policy and Innovation Conference. This conference is organized by the KICS EAP Hub, which is short for Knowledge and Innovation Exchange, Europe, Asia, and Pacific Hub. KICS is an initiative supported by the Global Partnership for Education and the International Development Research Center. Within KICS, there are 4 regional hubs. Our hub is composed of 21 countries in Europe, Asia, and the Pacific. And before I continue, I invite you to watch a short video to learn more about what we do at the KICS EAP Hub.
In GPE partner countries of the Europe, Asia, Pacific region, limited resources have been invested so far on mobilizing and using knowledge, data, and studies produced at the national and global level, identifying and learning from promising innovations, and sharing experiences on similar reforms in other countries. To respond to these challenges, the Knowledge and Innovation Exchange, KICS, Europe, Asia, and Pacific Hub connects knowledge by mobilizing global and national expertise for policy research and practice, innovation by identifying and learning from scalable innovations for policy and project design, and exchange by promoting a regional network for peer exchange and learning amongst national experts. The KICS EAP Hub creates opportunities for knowledge producers and users to meet, learn, and exchange experiences on what works and what doesn't work in improving their national education systems. The Hub is led by NORAG, with the support of the Global Partnership for Education and the International Development Research Center. It covers 21 countries located in Europe, Asia, the Pacific, Middle East, and North Africa. The Hub's activities are demand-driven and designed to give voice and visibility to key country actors and institutions while supporting them to improve the inclusion, equity, and quality of education systems and accelerate progress towards SDG 4. Which activities is the Hub offering to country participants? Webinars, learning cycles and workshops, regional conferences, podcasts, blog posts and video interviews, digital learning platform, and inter-country visits. Activities are conducted in English, Russian, and Arabic. Interested in engaging in the KICS EAP Hub? Visit us online.
Perfect. Thank you for watching the video. And now let's go quickly through the agenda for today's conference. Okay, so in today's conference, we're starting the third day of the KICS EPIC conference. And we were starting with the keynote address by Professor Isaac Fromming from Higher School of Economics, that is coming soon. And after we have a short break of 30 minutes, and we will have our first block of thematic parallel sessions, sessions 9 and 10, which will focus on session 9 on new directions in education assessment, and session 10 in assessments for learning in a changing world. And then we have another short break of 30 minutes, and we come back for another block of parallel sessions. Those will be sessions 11 and 12. Session 11 will focus on measuring educational results, and session 12 will then focus on reflection on education assessments and policy implications. We hope to see you in the following sessions that we'll have today as well. Okay, so it's time to start with our keynote. Let me first briefly introduce Professor Isaac Fromming. So Professor Isaac Fromming is the academic director of the Institute of Education of the Higher School of Economics, National Research University. He's a doctor of pedagogy, honored professor, honored teacher of the Russian Federation. From 1999 to 2011, he was the head of the educational program of the World Bank in Russia. His experience with the World Bank also extends to projects in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Afghanistan, Nepal, Turkmenistan, and India. From 2012 to 2016, he served as an advisor to the Minister of Education and Science of the Russian Federation. Since 2020, he is the academician of the International Academy of Education. And now I have the pleasure to pass the word to Professor Isaac Fromming, who we are happy to have here today with us.
Thank you very much. I was planning to speak Russian, and I'm going to speak Russian today, yet I am ready to answer questions asked in English, if any, and my slides are going to be available to all participants after this session. So if you have any specific concrete questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them. You can write me directly, and my request to the organizers would be to share my email address with the participants, because I have not included it on my slides. So let's start the presentation now. So today, the entire day is dedicated to education assessment and evaluation of the quality of education. We frequently discuss assessment techniques and assessment organization, yet I think we do not sufficiently discuss what specifically we need to evaluate or assess, because the forms, the structure, and the methods of assessment are of secondary value, in our opinion, compared to the outcomes of education. That's why I would like to start my today's topic with some models of education outcomes assessment. And these are the approaches based not only on the education institute of our university, that is called Russian Research Institute of the Higher School of Economics, or in English it is just briefly HSC University. And so I just want to present not only the results of our research, but also outcomes and findings of research carried out by a big team of experts with whom we have been cooperating for 4 years already. So before I start speaking on this exact topic, I would like to share why the outcome assessment is so important. Actually, today we are faced from process-based education towards outcome-based or competence-based education. And my colleagues at the university sometimes call this process managerialism, and they are sometimes critical of what we call the result-oriented or competence-oriented or competence-based learning. But I do trust that even though the process should be interesting, should be enjoyable, we need to understand what the process is leading to. And along with the attempts to better understand the process, we need to also better understand the result, the outcome, and we need to look at the process in terms of the result it leads to. So I want to share a very simple example that is going to be really very clear to the Russian-speaking audience, though it is going to be difficult to be translated. So in 1838, almost 200 years ago, the great Russian poet Pushkin wrote about Eugene Onegin's education, the main character of his poem. For empty sound the wrestle swore he, existence would not make a curse, knew not a yam from a curry, although we read him heaps of verse. I'm really very sympathetic of the interpreters now, but I had to bring this example in my presentation because 2 years ago, a part of the assessment was actually the reads meter and reads that meter. And if we look at what the results of literature as a subject were, for instance, in grade 7 in 2018, it was actually determination of this poetic meter or measure, and that was actually the basis for their assessment. So I wanted to draw your attention to the fact how slow the changes in outcome or result assessment go on. Actually, they have not changed. They seem not to have changed over these 200 years. But in reality, we should not be misled by such parallels that I have drawn now, because in reality, the situation has changed. In the 20th century, a very fast movement towards re-evaluation and assessment of the education results started. So it became clear that only subject-based learning was not sufficient, and some programs appeared that were targeted at changing the way of thinking. And of course, that was due to some changes at the labor market, and I'm going to speak about that later. And what was previously considered to be components of literacy, just the knowledge of writing, of counting, reading, were no longer enough. Today, we speak about climate knowledge literacy, digital literacy, and many other domains of literacy. And sometimes we say that there is a conceptual chaos out there in terms of understanding the concepts that need to be assessed. So we need to try to handle the chaos somehow. And for this purpose, we are using the human capital theory to understand the results of the education we want to achieve. So I just want to simply present the gist of this theory. So we are speaking about the knowledge, experience, skills, settings, behaviors, and attitudes that help a person be personally successful at work, and become a productive member of the society. So mid-20th century, the human capital theory actually started, and it very clearly differentiated between the general capital and the specific human capital. So the general human capital, the specific human capital actually includes very specific knowledge applicable to a certain workplace. And actually at that time, the professional education was focused on developing this specific capital, specific human capital, whereas the general human capital is applicable to different domains of human life, including the knowledge of languages, skills of working with information, general culture of behavior, and labor, etc. So over the years, the previous years, the specific human capital was actually the major focus of education. It actually was a pyramid of different subjects, different domain-based or subject-based knowledge aspects. Like, for instance, if we wanted to educate an IT specialist, we were focusing on discrete mathematics, on algorithmics, etc. So that was the way of developing this specific human capital. Again, I want to stress that that's the classical approach towards education, that the specific human capital is more important than the general one. But towards the end of the 20th century, several researches were carried out by specialists in economy that confirmed that not only the specific human capital is important for human development, but the general capital as well. What Heckman identified as non-cognitive qualities, like, for instance, openness to novelties, to other people, consciousness, persistence, and others. And like, for instance, Jackman brought an example of two kids with similar levels of preparedness in terms of academic knowledge, have different chances for success in life depending on their non-cognitive characteristics. There is also another research that actually seriously specified Heckman's findings. And here is a very important diagram that I think everyone who is involved in education should know. A group of researchers from the United States, led by Levy and Bournet, carried out a simple research. They actually analyzed labor operations in traditional professions, traditional occupations, and tried to understand how many of these operations have a routine or repeating character, and how many are non-routine, non-repeating, and demanding creative solutions. And the researchers also paid attention to the fact that in some occupations that seem to be purely physical, already started demanding for analytical, symbolical skills, operations that called for interpersonal communication skills. So the researchers started to analyze the dynamics of the operations within traditional occupations. And it turned out that even in sellers' work or in drivers' work, the share of interpersonal operations was increasing, as well as analytical operations, intuitive operations. So today, a truck driver, as one of the authors of this diagram mentions in his research, is actually not only a driver, but a logistics specialist, a logistics operation, because he has to choose the best way, the best route option from what the navigators are suggesting. Also, a driver today is a communication specialist because he has to deliver the cargo and to submit the cargo to the client. So these are the skills today that the labor market needs from drivers today, for instance. So again, we can see that the picture of education results and outcome today is getting more and more complicated. You know, as they say in thrillers, very frequently, I don't have any good news for you. because instead of subject-based knowledge, specific knowledge used to build up the specific human capital, we are going also to have things like attitude, behaviors, etc. But as the life gets more and more complicated, the system of education results is getting more and more difficult and complex. And today it includes three major domains: the subject-based competencies, the universal or transversal competencies, and personal characteristics, values, upbringing, behaviors, attitudes, etc. So what we are discussing now is actually a novelty for education, because this topic has been discussed really seriously and intensely over the recent decade or so. And since different groups started to work on this topic in parallel, the work has resulted in this conceptual chaos that I mentioned before. So we analyzed different frameworks of educational content, over 180 frameworks actually, and we were totally terrified by the fact that there is no common ground. There is actually nothing common between these frameworks. They are operating totally different terms, totally different concepts. So we decided to set up an international team incorporating colleagues from UK, Canada, China, South Korea, Poland, United States, Finland, and Russia, in order to agree upon a simple vision, a simple approach towards today's general literacy and the set of competencies that today's education targets at. So let's try to understand what these include. So we actually agreed that there are two types of literacy. Literacy that is subject-based, or the knowledge of some specific and important domains of everyday life. Like, for instance, 150 years ago, nobody discussed financial literacy. Today, financial literacy developing programs are actually a gold standard for any country. So today we can see some new types of knowledge that need to be incorporated quite fast into the education system. Today we also speak a lot about digital literacy, and now we have started to discuss epidemiological literacy. We have analyzed some exam resources and materials in Russia, in some other countries, that were developed during the pandemic in order to understand how we can assess the knowledge and perceptions of viruses, pathogens, and epidemics in our countries. And we actually concluded that in no country that we actually assessed, this this component of education is never evaluated. So we need to assess not some specific and profound knowledge of, for instance, epidemiology, but we need to evaluate some general minimum perceptions. So when I worked in the World Bank, I remember when I worked in India, we tried to elaborate a simple test to evaluate English language skills. Like specifically, how many children fail to write an essay towards the end of the language studies course. So that was actually a very simple test, but it gave us more than a complicated exam that would be difficult to administer and would actually target at very profound assessment. So I think that what we need to do is to regularly revisit the components of mandatory literacy and need to elaborate tools to assess it. And the second type of literacy, the second literacy domain is the so-called instrumental literacy, or the skill to use different tools of communication. And it seems that we really don't know how to assess it. When we speak about, for instance, digital literacy, we need to consider and assess it as instrumental literacy, instrumental competence. And we have elaborated a very simple tool to assess how well a school child is capable of finding information online, or what are the keywords he or she uses for internet searching, and how he makes preferences based on the drop-down lists, etc. So we can say that today our children are what we call digital aborigines, and they have really, the perception is that they have really very good digital skills. But in reality, the research has shown that many young people fail in successfully searching for information. And this is a very interesting finding. By the way, I'm going to later share a link to this tool that we elaborated. It's really interesting. It is going to be free of charge, available to everyone starting 2022. And one more component on this slide is non-competent literacy, self-perception, self-understanding, self-consciousness, self-control, etc. Some researchers think that it should be also a part of the basic education. Others disagree, but that's just an attempt to create a simple construct.
I will skip a slide, one slide here, and would like to, since our time is slowly running out, I would like to share a very simple framework that we suggest for assessing universal competencies or soft skills. There are very big, there's a great danger in making long lists. The reason is that the longer the list of these skills, the greater the risk that different schools, different countries will have different lists of skills. And this has to do with linguistic problems, the problems of language, and the problems of change and tradition. And so within our consortium, we have agreed that we should talk about we shouldn't talk about specific techniques or skills, but of certain blocks of competencies. And we identified 3 of these blocks. The first of which is thinking, the ability to think reflectively, creatively, understand and interpret, analyze and make arguments. So this is the cognitive ability to solve both theoretical and practical problems. That is the first large block of soft skills or universal skills that we need to develop and assess. Relating to this, I should mention that there are instruments to assess this both for general purposes and both within the framework of a particular subject. For example, there are courses on developing creative thinking, but there are also courses on math or history, which include development of these skills. The second large block that needs to be developed is competency in interaction with others. Often, cooperation skills and collaboration skills are separated, but we think this is a skill, because if you are developing communication skills, then you will develop the foundation for cooperation as well. So cooperation and communication shouldn't be divided. Competency in interaction with others is a very important block of education outcomes that we also need to assess. Today, there are no tests, and maybe this is good or bad, which are able to assess your communicative or cooperation skills. But in P's study from 2012, there's an attempt to assess group problem solving. And in this case, we can assess not only how the problem was solved, but the process of cooperation among those who are solving the problem. And we think that in countries such as Canada and Finland, there's interesting experience in teachers observing how children undertake interaction. And once every 6 months, they send commentary to the parents of children. But for the most part, our global education system isn't doing a very good job of forming and assessing these skills. And finally, the third competency, which for the most part is looked over and ignored in assessment and in curricula development. And that is competency in interaction with yourself, self-regulation, self-control, self-organization. We not only aren't able to assess and create these skills, we don't even talk about them very much. And so I think, colleagues, that when we discuss assessment of education outcomes, it's very important today to remember the assessment of basic competencies, basic literacy, and also interaction with others and with oneself. I would like to share several examples of countries which are attempting to include these universal competencies in their education programs. Let's start with Finland. So there's an education standard which assumes competencies such as thinking, the ability to learn, career development, how the culture of interaction is developed. And we see that these competencies go beyond the disciplines which are included in a traditional curriculum. And this is the Finnish example. If we look at what's happening in Canada, we see also the inclusion of communication, collaboration, critical thinking. But here, for example, we don't see competencies related to self-organization. And we think this is a problem from our perspective. If we look at Korea, we can see that self-management is considered one of the most important education outcomes expected from pupils, expected of pupils. China is an interesting example. This is a fairly new construction, which was developed, I believe, 3 years ago as a new framework for educational contents. And here we see the idea of self-development, which is very important for Chinese culture. And we also see the idea of civic responsibility, which we haven't clearly delineated in our system. In China, this approach is closely integrated with particular subjects and curriculum. We had a very interesting discussion with our colleagues from England. England is an interesting example where the system basically could not cope with the organic inclusion of universal competencies and began a kind of movement backwards through the idea of back to the basics. A return to basic knowledge. And we are not against basic knowledge, of course. It's very difficult, but necessary to include them with, combine them with the development of universal competencies. As for Russia, we have a national federal education standard, which includes universal competencies and personal outcomes, but in practice, this is almost ignored. Finally, colleagues, I want to say something very important. Today, our pedagogy and our parents are not quite ready. They're not willing to acknowledge that school is responsible for the development of universal competencies. A substantial portion of teachers, and I include the data in my presentation, think that creativity is something that you're born with. Skills of cooperation and self-management are the family's responsibility and not the school's. Here you can see that almost 40% of teachers believe that the school cannot help in the formation of creativity. But sadly, parents agree with this. Fewer than 30% of parents think that the school can teach creativity to their children. And so, dear colleagues, I will start to finish my presentation. And I want to say that today, the education system globally, as for the understanding of comprehensive education outcomes, is in a difficult situation. There is no single approach. There are discussions, and there are many different lists of literacy types and competencies. And this doesn't allow us to develop proper education assessment tools. And we think that during the coming decades, the work of theoreticians and practitioners will be focused on improving these structures, these frameworks, and developing new assessment tools. We believe that universal competencies can be and should be included in the educational process. And here we list the types of approaches, but I won't talk about it in my presentation, but I will send you this presentation both in English and in Russian. We have the translation already, and we'll share it with you. The last thing I would like to say is that we believe that the entrance point for transforming the education system should be elementary school. Experience shows that the education system includes so-called unimportant subjects. I don't agree with this, but many teachers consider certain subjects unimportant. They think that language and mathematics are important subjects and the others are less important. But if we look at Korea, we can see that we can begin forming new education outcomes through these so-called unimportant subjects. And this is a platform for developing universal competencies. Here, I would like to stop, end my presentation, because I would prefer to spend the remaining time discussing your questions. Thanks for your attention, and thank you very much. Once again, I reiterate that we will send you links to the presentations in Russian and English related to this subject.
Thank you very much, Professor Fromming. Thank you for this great presentation. And I think it is already sparking quite some questions from our participants. And I may start with two of them, which both touch upon the idea of universal competencies. So the first one is from Zana Zajitova, which asks, I have a question about competencies in different countries. Are the competencies you reviewed universal for all specialties, or are they particular to one specialty? And if I may, I'll add the question from Saule Kanzina as well, who asks, should the universal competencies be assessed as education outcomes, or is it enough to form them and include them in formative assessments in the educational process? Or does the principle that we learn what is assessed, and if it is not assessed, it doesn't matter, is valid here too? So Professor Fromming, if you want to start addressing these questions, and I welcome all other participants to include any other questions if they would like to.
Thank you. These are interesting and very good questions. To simplify our discussion, I have to say that I agree that what is not assessed doesn't matter. I understand that this is a very rough principle, a rough statement, and we can give dozens of arguments for why this is not the case, but on average, this is true if we look at these statistics. But there's a very important thing here. What does it mean to assess? And who is the assessor? Because assessment is not just your grade in school. Assessment is, to a large degree, especially for teenagers, this is their assessment, the assessment of their peers, assessment of their parents, and their self-assessment. And so I would say that what is not reflected upon doesn't matter. So assessment is a form of reflection, we might say. And so we believe that you can't, for example, assess with simple instruments very difficult constructs such as values, but you can understand how values are formed if we are able to observe the behavior, interpret it, and provide feedback. I apologize, this is a very basic issue, and so I would put it simply. What does not produce feedback doesn't matter. So I would rephrase my previous answer. It's not what isn't assessed that doesn't matter. It's what has no feedback doesn't matter. So feedback is an absolutely critical, vital element of education.
Thank you, Professor Fromme. Thank you. I think that touches very well on the importance of not only measuring, but also feeding these into the educational process. So we have received in the meantime one more question from Duishun Shamatov, which touches upon a bit the idea of the terminologies that we use to define competencies. So Duishun asks, I often wonder about overcomplicating concepts and terminologies, especially when they are referring to competencies. People often struggle to explain to each other what these different competencies mean. And how do we know if we are talking about the same ideas when we talk about certain competencies? How do we know that we are all understanding it the same way? And then he adds a different question, if you want to address it afterwards, about how do we assess some competencies which are difficult to measure? And he adds a quote from Einstein who says, not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. I think that resonates with the discussion very well. Professor Fromme.
I would like to look at the question because he asked in English. If I want to make sure I understand it here.
So Professor Fromme, so you said you wanted to look at the question, right? If you want, I can repeat it because he sent to us privately, but I can share it in the chat as well. Yes, okay.
Please repeat the question.
Absolutely.
And even in English.
Okay, perfect. So it is about overcomplicating concepts and terminologies, especially when we talk about competencies. So the question that Duishun Shamatov asked is how people often struggle to explain to each other what these different types of competencies are. So how do we know if we are talking about the same ideas when we talk about certain competencies? How can we get to a common understanding of these competencies? That was the first question. I think we can address them separately for clarity.
I think this is a vital issue. And in order to solve it, we have created this international consortium. We have, just imagine, professors and practitioners together from different countries who have gathered together to agree on competencies. This was very difficult because, you know, I'll put it honestly, our Finnish colleagues said that there must be the competency of learning to learn, the ability to learn, learning how to learn. And we said, no, let's restrict ourselves to 3 large blocks of competencies. And so we tried to create this simple structure. A person needs to be smart. In other words, think productively. A person needs to effectively interact with others and and manage himself. 3 simple tasks. I think these can be agreed upon. After this, we can talk about the nuances of how to assess this and what they include. But we see these 3 basic tasks very clearly. They're not simple, but they can be formulated simply. That's how I'd put it.
Perfect. Thank you, Professor Fromen. And I think we have an interesting question that we just received right now, which connects very well with this idea of the assessment for learning, for practical use of the assessment. So this question was posed from Kamal Prasad Koirala from Nepal, who asks, how can we use assessment as learning in present situation? And if I may add, Professor, I think you talked about the digital literacy, the epidemiology literacy. How is it that we can, and you talked a little bit about the results as well of the digital literacy, that we assume that we are talking about kids that know very well how to use these tools, but the results of your research showed that they actually struggle with doing internet research. So how do you think we can use assessments as learning in this present situation, and how should we take this forward according to your recommendations, Professor Fromen?
I think that first of all, I hope we discuss formational assessments today. And I want to say that thanks to one of the questions, we have managed to formulate an important idea, which is that the main part of assessment, the most important aspect of assessment, is feedback. There are many studies that show that the more feedback there is, the better. And so I think that including feedback in our work with children will help very much to improve these types of literacy. There's nothing complicated about it.
Perfect. And we had one of our participants who raised her hand and would like to pose a question orally. If I may give the floor to Mirin Sidikova from Kyrgyzstan.
I just wanted to give my response. This is a very interesting presentation, and I would really like to look at these studies on the work that you mentioned in your presentation. This is very relevant to us. I'm from Kyrgyzstan. Thank you very much. Thank you for your kind words. We will send the links to all the works published. Our time is finishing up. And I want to thank Marina and the other organizers for the invitation. I feel a little bit uncomfortable, embarrassed that my presentation was only in Russian, but I promise to provide the same presentation in English.
Thank you very much, Professor Fromen. No need to be embarrassed. I think we had our interpreters helping us today with English, and we got a very good understanding of your presentation. It was a very thought-provoking one, and we are very happy to have welcomed you as our keynote speaker for day 3 of our conference. And I'm sure a lot of these discussions will continue in our parallel sessions.